If you are aiming for $700,000 in your super because a retirement calculator told you that is the magic number for a comfortable life, you might be working 3 to 5 years longer than you actually need to. Most Australians are told to keep saving until they hit a big lump sum, but they are missing the one variable that actually decides when to stop, and it is called the age pension cliff. For a couple sitting on $500,000 in super, working one more year to save an extra $50,000 can cut their age pension by $3,900 a year, purely because of how the asset's test taper rate works. $3 a fortnight sounds small on its own, but multiply it across every extra $1,000 saved past the threshold, and across every year you will draw the pension, and the maths turns against you fast. That is not a rounding error. That is real money you hand back for the privilege of clocking in another 12 months. I have watched people chase that $700,000 figure for years, staying in jobs that wore them down, when the numbers already said they could stop. Nobody sat them down and showed them the actual point where their super and the age pension meet their real cost of living. In this video, I am going to show you the income crossover point, the exact moment your super and the age pension combine to cover the life you actually want. Once you hit that point, every extra day at the office is a day of your go-go years you never get back. We are starting with the $300,000 reality check the big banks are not exactly putting in their brochures. For a single homeowner, the real sweet spot is not $700,000. It sits much closer to $333,000. Stay under that number in assessable assets, and you qualify for the full age pension worth $31,223 a year, and your super only has to cover a small gap between that and the lifestyle you actually want. That one fact changes the whole savings target for most people watching this. Instead of grinding toward a number a bank picked for you, you are working toward a number the government sets, and it is a lot closer than you think. Does your current balance already clear that bar? For a lot of people watching, it already does. Here is the mechanism behind it. Once your assessable assets go over that $333,000 line for a single, or $499,000 for a couple, the age pension does not just stop, it tapers. For every $1,000 you own above the threshold, your pension drops by $3 a fortnight, which works out to $78 a year. $3 a fortnight sounds tiny until you multiply it across every $1,000 you saved on top of the threshold, and across every year you will draw the pension. You have probably been conditioned to think a bigger super balance is always better. In the Australian system, there is actually a dead zone where saving more earns you less, and almost nobody warns you about it before you fall into it. The taper exists because the age pension is a means-tested safety net, not an automatic entitlement tied purely to your age. The government is trying to direct payments toward people who need them the most, which sounds fair in theory, but it creates a very real disincentive for anyone hovering near the threshold, the exact spot where a lot of hard-working Australians end up sitting. Picture a couple with $500,000 in super, just over that $499,000 threshold. They decide to keep working 2 more years and save another $100,000, thinking they are building a bigger buffer. Instead, their combined age pension drops by $7,800 a year. Think about what that actually buys in a normal year, close to what a lot of retirees spend on council rates, electricity, and a car rego renewal combined. To get back to the income they had before, they now have to draw down their own savings just to replace the pension they lost. 2 extra years at work, and they end up spending their own money to stand still. That is the trap nobody talks about at the retirement seminars. But maybe your situation is different. Maybe the full age pension alone would not cover the life you actually want to live. with grandkids to visit and a caravan you have been promising yourself. That is exactly where the income crossover framework comes in, and it is the part most calculators skip entirely. Here is the framework I actually use with people now, and I call it the 3-bucket safety buffer. Bucket 1 is your essential floor. That is the age pension, plus the minimum drawdown from your super, the base income that covers rent, or the mortgage, food, and power, no matter what the share market is doing that year. That minimum drawdown percentage moves as you age, starting lower in your 60s and rising as you get older, which is the government's way of making sure your super actually gets spent across your retirement instead of sitting untouched in an account. Bucket 2 is your lifestyle gap. This is the extra $15,000 to $20,000 a year on top of the floor. The money for flights to see the grandkids, a caravan trip, or simply not thinking twice about dinner out. Bucket 3 is your sequence risk buffer. 2 years of cash sitting separately from your growth assets. This is not about avoiding risk altogether. It is about buying yourself time. A market crash in year 1 of retirement does far more damage than the same crash hitting in year 10, because you are forced to sell assets at low prices just to fund everyday life instead of letting them recover. 2 years of cash breaks that cycle. You spend from the buffer, leave the growth assets alone, and let the market do what it has always eventually done, which is recover. It works the same way as keeping enough put aside to cover the council rates notice and the car re-Joe renewal without needing to check the share price first. Ask yourself honestly which of those 3 buckets you have never actually sat down and calculated for your own numbers. Now watch how this works with real numbers. Take someone with $300,000 in super, draw down 5% a year, which is $15,000, and add the full single-age pension of $31,223. That combination hands you $46,223 a year in tax-free income without ever touching the lump sum target most calculators obsess over. I used to tell people to aim for the ASFA comfortable figure, around $630,000 for a single person. I was wrong to leave it there. I have seen too many people hit 67 with $700,000 in the bank and no health left to actually enjoy it. Now I look at the income your money actually produces every single year, not the size of the pile sitting quietly in the account. Working longer to chase a bigger number does not just cost you time on the calendar. It costs you the version of yourself with the energy to actually spend that money, and that is a bill compound interest can never repay. If you are a hard-working Australian who is tired of the 1 more year trap, and you want a retirement plan built on your real numbers instead of a bank brochure, that is exactly what this channel is for, so go ahead and subscribe. Even once the maths checks out clearly on paper, your brain might still quietly scream that it is not enough. That feeling is not a character flaw. It is closer to a biological glitch, and it is worth understanding before it talks you into another 5 years you do not actually need. Life expectancy for Australian men now sits around 81, and for women around 85. Those numbers get quoted constantly. What almost nobody quotes is healthy life expectancy, the years you get to live without a disability or a chronic condition slowing you down. For men, that number drops to around 71.6, and for women around 73.6, according to the Australian Institute of Health and Welfare. Sit with that gap for a second. If you are 55 now, and your healthy years run out somewhere in your early 70s, you might have less than 2 decades of genuinely mobile, active, pain-free life left. That is not meant to scare you. It is meant to put a number on something you have probably felt but never measured. The sense that a year in your 60s is worth more than a year in your 40s ever was. Your 60s through your early 70s are usually your go-go years, the stretch when you still have the health and the freedom to travel. Take the grandkids somewhere, or finally use the caravan sitting in the driveway. Push your retirement date back a few extra years chasing a slightly bigger balance, and you are not just quietly delaying an income stream. You are spending your go-go years at a desk instead. Think back to 2008 and the global financial crisis, when balanced super funds lost around 20% of their value in a matter of months. People who told themselves they would work just one more year to let their super recover ended up working until 2012, sometimes later. It took most balanced funds several years just to climb back to where they started, and that recovery time came straight out of the decade people had counted on for travel and time with family. The market eventually came back. The years they spent waiting for it never did. There is a second cost that rarely gets talked about. Staying in a job you have grown to resent through your 60s does not just drain your time. It is a pattern researchers who study aging and work keep finding that prolonged stress in a job you dislike appears to speed up cognitive decline as well. Ask yourself honestly how many more years of full-time work your body has in it before something, a knee, a hip, a health scare, ends up making the decision for you instead. Let's run the scenario a lot of people in your position secretly worry about. You retire, and in your very first year, the market drops 15%. Meet Gary and Sue, a couple with $450,000 between them. They retire without a real plan for a downturn, just a general sense that markets go up over time. When the drop hits, they panic. They pull their balanced fund out and move it to cash at the bottom, locking in the loss permanently instead of riding it out. The money that was meant to last them 30 years just took a hit it may never fully recover from because they sold low and now have to buy back in high, if they buy back in at all. Once you sell at the bottom, you are no longer invested when the recovery happens. And the biggest gains after a crash often land in the first year or two off the bottom, the exact window a panic sale removes you from. Now picture the same couple, same $450,000, same 15% crash, but this time they built the 3-bucket safety buffer before they stopped working. They already have $60,000 sitting in a high-interest cash account, completely separate from their growth assets. So when the crash hits, they simply stop drawing from the share component of their super for 2 years. They live on that cash buffer combined with their age pension, still paying the same electricity bills and the same council rates as everyone else, just paying them from cash instead of from a portfolio that needs time to heal. There is one more detail worth understanding, because it affects how Centrelink actually treats that cash buffer. Under the deeming rules, your first chunk of financial assets is assumed to earn a lower rate, currently 1.25%, and anything above that threshold is deemed to earn 3.25%, regardless of what your account is actually paying in real interest. That deemed amount is what counts toward your age pension income test, not your real bank interest. It means holding cash in your buffer does not quietly wreck your pension the way people sometimes assume. Gary and Sue come out the other side of the crash with their share portfolio intact and their pension barely touched. The difference between them and the version of themselves who panicked was not luck. It was 2 years of cash sitting in the right place before the crash ever happened. So how do you actually build that buffer and make the switch? It is worth saying clearly, this is not about writing a resignation letter and walking out the door. It is a transition, and it starts with one number most people never bother to calculate. Step 1 is working out your real number, not the generic industry average you might have seen in a magazine or a brochure. Sit down and add up what your household actually spends in a normal year: the mortgage or rent, the groceries, the power bill, the odd Medicare gap payment, the strata levy if you are in an apartment. That real figure, not someone else's average, is the only one that should decide when you stop. Step 2 is where the real leverage sits, and it is called a transition to retirement pension, or TTR. Once you reach 60, your preservation age, you can start drawing an income from your super while you are still working. Most people think retirement is a single date on the calendar. A TTR lets you turn it into a slow ramp down instead. Here is how it works in practice. You drop from 5 days a week to 3, cutting your hours and your stress without cutting your household off completely. Your employer is still paying the super guarantee, currently 12%, into your account on whatever salary you are earning. On top of that, you add a small draw from your TTR pension to fill the gap your reduced hours left behind. Because you are over 60, that income is tax-free, the same as any other super withdrawal past that age, so there is no extra tax penalty for easing yourself out the door instead of walking out all at once. There is also a cap on how much you can draw each year through a TTR pension, generally a set percentage of your balance, so it is worth checking your own numbers before you commit to a set number of days. Run the numbers and the result surprises most people. A part-time salary at 3 days a week, plus 12% super guarantee on that income, plus a modest TTR draw, can add up to close to what your old full-time take-home pay actually was. You get 2 extra days a week back, and your bank balance barely notices. On paper, this is close to a perfect plan. So why do 9 out of 10 people who see these numbers never actually pull the trigger? It has nothing to do with the maths. It has everything to do with what happens the moment you stop being the person everyone at work relies on. Even when the math says stop, most people keep working anyway, and it is not because they are bad with money. It comes down to 2 things psychologists call loss aversion and identity fusion. You are not just walking away from a paycheck. You are walking away from being Gary the project manager or Sue the office manager, the version of yourself that people have relied on for decades. It is completely normal to feel terrified at the thought of stopping. You have spent 40 years being useful, being productive, being the person with the answer. Sitting on the porch on a Tuesday morning can feel less like freedom and more like decline, even when your bank account says otherwise. Ask yourself, is it the money holding you back? Or is it the thought of not being needed the same way? This is not weakness. It is the same wiring that made you reliable at work in the first place, the instinct to be needed, and it does not switch off just because your final payslip does. Here is a small shift that helps. Do not frame it as retiring. Frame it as pivoting to a project. Give yourself a 6-month sabbatical instead of a permanent exit. It sounds like a small difference in wording, but it lowers the stakes enough for your brain to actually consider it, because a sabbatical can be reversed and a resignation feels final. I remember a client who kept pushing his retirement date back, year after year, even though his numbers had worked for a long time. When we finally talked about why, it turned out he had no idea who he would have coffee with once he was not walking into that office every morning. We had to find him a walking group before he felt safe enough to actually resign. The maths had worked out for a long time. The mornings and the missing coffee were the actual problem. If any of that sounds familiar, you are not failing at retirement. You are just human, and the fix is smaller than it feels from where you are standing right now. Retirement was never really about hitting one giant number. It is about building an income stream that covers your life. If your super and your age pension already cover your essential floor, and you have 2 years of cash sitting there as a buffer against a bad market, you have already reached what I call the stop point, even if your balance is nowhere near $700,000. If you want to stay across the pension indexation landing in September 2026, and the other changes that affect this exact calculation every year, subscribe to Aussie Retirement with Bob so you do not miss it. Your money can always be replaced. Your 60s cannot. Stop saving for a life you are already rich enough to live.